student at Harvard Medical School and a representative of the Harvard Graduate Council, which is co-sponsoring this event along with the Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. We're very fortunate today to have Walter Isaacson here to speak to us about leadership in modern times. I can't think of many people who are as qualified as Mr. Isaacson to be speaking on this subject, given that he has not only written extensively about leadership and great American leaders, past and present, but also himself led many of our nation's most influential organizations. Mr. Isaacson currently serves as the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, which is a nonpartisan educational and policy studies institute in Washington, D.C. He has been the chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. Mr. Isaacson began his career at the Sunday Times of London and then the New Orleans Times-Picayune State Item. He joined Time magazine in 1978 and served as a political correspondent, national editor, and editor of new media before becoming the magazine's 14th editor in 1996. He became chairman and CEO of CNN in 2001, and then president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He is the author of numerous books, including most recently American Sketches, a book on great leaders, creative thinkers, and heroes of a hurricane. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walter Isaacson.
I hope to speak for a few minutes and then make this much of a discussion. But the challenge of leadership in the current time boils down to the extreme polarization and ripping apart of the center that has, I think, been the core of what America works. I happen to be, so you know my politics, one of those people who believe that the country is best governed when governed from the center. And this is something that hasn't been happening in the past 15 or 20 years. Part of it is a great ideological divide. Part of it is just pure partisanship. As Henry Kissinger used to say about the faculty club a few blocks away, the fights are so bitter because the stakes are so small. People were getting worked up over the small differences they have just on pure partisan reasons. I've always looked for leadership as being a form of finding common ground. When I was a student here, I started work on a book with a friend of mine who was a classmate of mine in college, Evan Thomas, and it was about 6 foreign policy friends. We called it the Wise Men because they were 6 people who were brought in by Harry Truman to help shape American foreign policy right after World War II. And they weren't famous people, but they had a passion for a foreign policy that would rise above partisanship. It was Gene Atchison, Abel Harriman, John McCloy, Robert Lovett, Kennan, and Bolin, all of whom had intersected at Yale or Harvard, had gone to Wall Street together, and then gone into American foreign policy. And the reason we did it is because we were coming out of the Vietnam period back when we were in college. We came just after the end of the Vietnam War, but that had polarized this nation. And so we were looking for a time when people tried to lead the nation by finding the common ground based on the values we stood for. And so we picked these 6 people, 3 of them Republicans, 3 of them Democrats, all best friends who worked for Democratic and Republican administrations. One of the touchstones of the partisanship was Robert Lovett, one of our characters, when he tells Harry Truman about the idea of having a plan to rebuild Europe, because they realized they were in a great global struggle after the end of World War II. They have a plan for the economic rebuilding of Europe that they've been talking about, and he has to tell President Truman, and we want to call it the Marshall Plan, not the Truman Plan, because that will cause it to be less partisan. It's General Marshall, somebody stands above partisanship. So Truman says to Lovett, "You're absolutely right. Otherwise, those damn Republicans will try to kill it." And there's a pause, and Lovett says, "You forget, Mr. President, I am one of those damn Republicans." And Truman says, "Yes, I always forget," because he had a group of foreign policy advisors that were not picked based on party. The other thing about the Wise Men is by doing so, they could have a leadership that was extremely creative. At the end of World War II, as Averell Harriman said, Americans were ready to come back home, go to the movies and drink Coca-Cola. Nobody wanted to be engaged in the world. But as the war was ending, from the Potsdam Conference, from the Yalta Conference to the Potsdam Conference, it suddenly becomes clear that the United States is going to be engaged, having just won a war with its allies, including Russia, against fascism, is going to be engaged in a new global struggle, which is against the spread of Soviet-backed communism, and that you're going to need a whole new set of institutions to deal with that struggle. And so they had a creativity as well as a bipartisanship when they did it. And that creativity led them to understand that the new struggle they were going to be engaged in was going to be partly a military struggle, so they create, out of whole cloth, and never been done before, NATO, a defensive military alliance. They realized it was going to be an economic struggle, so they create the World Bank and all the Bretton Woods institutions, you know, the IMF, the GATT, which again will be an international trade. They realized it would be a struggle for hearts and minds. So you have Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and other things coming up. They too realized that we're going to have to show that our side will be more prosperous in a way. So that's where the Marshall Plan and other things come from. So you have this enormous burst of creativity of institutions nobody ever thought of having before, and even the United Nations comes out of that. And that burst of creativity happens within a 2 or 3 year period, 1946, 47, 48, maybe 49. And then you even have to frame it to say, what is a struggle? So you have George Kennan and others framing it as a containment doctrine, and NSC 68, which sort of balances the commitments we're going to need to the resources we have. So there's this great framework for it and great new creative institutions. The reason I say this is because we're in a similar period. And, you know, at least we kind of woke up to it a bit on September 11, 2001, which is that there's another struggle going on in this world. And even though the Cold War is over, we're engaged in the global struggle. And yet, it's been almost 10 years. There's been absolutely no creativity. We're still using the old institutions. We're still using NATO, which was created as a defensive alliance to stop tanks going through the Volga Gap in Germany. We're using it to be involved in Afghanistan. We're still using Voice of America and Radio Free Europe instead of creating a new Facebook or Google Groups or YouTube that would be a way of interacting and engaging with the world. We're still using, you know, broadcast radio. We're still using the old banking institutions. And so there hasn't been a comparable period of creativity, partly because after the brief period after 9/11, there became again the polarization, and nobody could really work together to create new ways of looking at the world. We haven't even agreed in a nonpartisan way what the struggle is. There's been no Kennan saying, I mean, Kennan didn't say the struggle was against communism. That wouldn't have worked. I mean, it was very specific how he defined it, which is the spread of Soviet-backed communists that tried to expand through this world. We were going to contain them. It was a pretty simple concept. Now the notion of radical Islamic jihadism, whatever it may be, there's not even a great agreement of what we're struggling against in this world, partly because everybody has made it a polarized and partisan activity. Having been so appalled by the growing polarization after the Life, I actually wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin is the founding father, first of all, who winks at us. I mean, he's just sort of the only normal dude amongst the founders, but also in a group of founders that has really brilliant people like Jefferson and Madison, and really passionate people like John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams, and men of high rectitude like George Washington. There had to be one person who said, I'm the glue, I can put it together and find the common ground. And for example, you know, at the Constitutional Convention, when they're pulling themselves apart because they're all so brilliant, they can't compromise, Franklin finally gets up, he's the oldest guy at the convention, and he says, I am so old that something has happened to me, it's going to happen to you as well, so watch out. As you get older, you're going to realize that sometimes you've been wrong at times, and that the person next to you might be right. So look at the person next to you and assume that they may be right at times. So when we were young tradesmen in Philadelphia, we had to put together a joint of wood. It didn't quite fit. You'd shave a little from one side, take a little from the other. So you had a joint that would hold together for centuries. So we too at this Constitutional Convention went through each part with some of our demands if we're going to have a constitution that will hold together for centuries. And his point was that compromisers don't make great heroes. People don't write about compromisers that much. But they do make great democracies. That's the whole point of a democracy, is finding the common ground, the common good. So he's the one who proposes, there's a big fight they were having on the big states, little states versus, equal votes per state and proportional representation. He's the one, after the Connecticut Compromise is defeated, to propose having a House and a Senate, proportional representation and equal votes per state. And he says, line up, and we're each going to have to come up with some of our own demands and do it. And they do. And he even understood in a sectarian world that what America's strength would be was that there's some professor at Harvard who once wrote a very disparaging sentence about Ben Franklin, which is all he gave to the founding was a notion of good-natured religious tolerance. Well, the notion of good-natured religious tolerance was about the most important notion you could have at that period. I mean, most of America had been founded because England couldn't get its act together in good nature. That is things we're still struggling for in this world. This is the magic of America, that a place like Philadelphia with Franklin could have Moravians and Jews and Anglicans and Quakers all working together. And so Franklin, during his lifetime, contributed to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were doing a great hall for visiting preachers of the First Great Awakening. It was called the New Hall. If you go to look in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, it's still there on your left, that building, so-called the New Hall. And Franklin wrote the fundraising document, which begins by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, we can learn. And on his deathbed, he's the largest individual contributor to the McVeigh Synagogue, which is the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. And it was that notion of a good-natured religious tolerance of people living together and finding common ground as opposed to splitting in sectarian ways that is still the greatest struggle in this world, and so what American values stand for. That's why when he died, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, they had 15,000 people marching, in which all 40 ministers, preachers, and priests of Philadelphia hung guns with the rabbi of the Jews to march with him to the grave. So those are the struggles we're still fighting for, and our politics, I don't think, has become very suited to dealing with those things. Ever since I've been writing about these things, it's gotten worse and worse, so maybe it shows biography doesn't help very much. I do think that for many, many years, for most of my career, I was a journalist. I think there are two major contributors to this polarization and partisanship, and one of them is the media. The media, all throughout my career, generally loves conflict. You like debate. You love pitting people off, and that's understandable. Nobody ever made a great headline out of Canada and U.S. agree on trade arrangements or something. It's conflicts that make the news. But something different has happened that is more technological. And what happened was, at least for the past 70 years or so, most of the 20th century, you had, because of the technology, a broadcast media. Meaning you had generally a trend towards monopoly newspapers in town because of both the technology of the cost of printing presses and the natural monopoly that comes when you're trying to get advertising in the town. And so there'd be one or two, maybe three newspapers, but it tended to all govern. So newspapers had to cover a broad spectrum and get a very broad readership. And even more importantly, broadcast was that way, especially television broadcast when it comes in the early 1950s. Because not everybody can start a TV station. Basically there's limited, especially back in the 50s and 60s, there's 4 or 5 channels at most, 3 major networks at most. The barrier to entry to creating a network was huge. So if you were doing the news on a network in the 60s, 70s even, and you were Walter Cronkite or John Chancellor or somebody like that, you had to get more than 1/3 of the viewers watching in order to win, in order to be successful. And that meant getting a very broad base. When you said that's the way it is, it had to appeal not to one narrow segment of the population. It had to try to get a mass audience. That's what mass media means. The advent of the digital media, not just the internet, but everything from satellite to whatever, allows there to be hundreds of cable channels, thousands of internet news sites, tens of thousands of regularly read blogs, spectrum of talk radio, whatever. And in order to succeed in such a world, even in cable TV, where there's only, say, 200, 300 choices, you don't have to get 1/3 of the audience. You just have to get a loyal 1% or 2% of the audience. That's how you end up being successful if you're CNN or Fox News or whatever. I ran CNN, and I was the last person to run CNN when CNN was easily the #1 network. It wasn't because I was particularly good, it was because there were no other major news networks. They were just rising. But what Fox and MSNBC discovered is that if you've got a passionate, ardent, partisan audience, and Murdoch is not all that political, more so than he's a businessman. It's a cold calculation. The Times of London can endorse Tony Blair while Fox is doing O'Reilly. But it was a cold and smart calculation that if you got 1 or 2% of the audience to ardently watch you every night and to watch you for the full hour or whatever, you were going to have the highest ratings of the 200-channel network. Likewise, obviously on the net, if you're a blogger or if you have a news site and you're provocative and you can draw a passionate, loyal audience, that's going to get you a greater, user base than trying to be some broad-based thing that doesn't have any passive use. So the media itself, in a time of fracturing, tends to more passionate and to some extent polarizing and partisan type of thing. This is not new. This has nothing to do with analog versus digital. It is true in Philadelphia when Ben Franklin gets there in 1750, and then 11 newspapers, he decides to start the 12th. If you're trying to just get a slice of an audience, it helps to be partisan. So there was a Penn family newspaper, and there was the proprietors had a newspaper, and the Quakers had it, but so did the radical agrarians, and so you had a lot of royalists. Everybody sort of had their broadsheets, and they were pretty vibrant at the time. It's just more so in a world where it's not 12, but 12,000 possible outlets for news, that people tend to be more shrill. There are other reasons for the partisanship, I think, one of which is redistricting and gerrymandering. When I was growing up in New Orleans, we had one congressional district that pretty much had the inner city and the suburbs. So it had wealthy white people in Metairie, and it had inner city people. I grew up in the inner city myself, and we elected Hale Boggs. Hale Boggs, somebody to get most of the black vote, a lot of the white vote, and he was somebody who then governed from the middle. He had to please a broad middle ground in New Orleans. And so when the civil rights bills of 61, 62, 63 come along, he and Lyndon Johnson and some other Southern Democrats are able to bridge the divide and pass the 64 voting rights, 63 voting rights, 64 civil rights bill, because they had to. As soon as Hale Boggs dies and his widow leaves the scene, they carve up that district. Because the Democrats want to carve it up and the Republicans want to carve it. The Republicans want a nice, safe district in the suburban part of New Orleans, conservative white suburbs. Democrats, and because of the Voting Rights Act, they need to have districts that are sure to elect blacks, and according to the Voting Rights Act, trying to make sure that there was representation from all groups. So you had an inner city district that tended to elect Bill Jefferson, for example, who's now in jail, and a suburban district where people like David Duke, a Ku Klux Klansman, was running. So that polarization has happened because both parties want safe districts, and if you're running in a safe district, all you have to do is worry about your extreme flank, somebody challenging you in a primary. You don't have to worry about getting the center. There are many other reasons, but I just wanted to set the table for why I think there's a polarization partisanship, why I think it's antithetical to what this nation is all about, and why I think it's a great challenge we face in leadership. So now I'd love to open it up to some questions and thoughts. Yes, sir.
I hope you will go.
And maybe identify yourself as a
Reg McCain, Harvard Institute for Honors and Retirement, and not only do I hope you will go on to suggest how we might solve this problem that you so blankly and accurately addressed, or excessive partisanship. But you began, my other question was that you began by pointing out how you believe that the country is best joined on the center. But of course, you never define exactly what that political center is. I wonder what it is. I wonder if Obama is part of it, as I think.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying the way to solve this is for voters to decide that they're fed up with people who are obstructionists on either side.
Sounds like an endorsement of the Tea Party.
It sounds like an attack on the Tea Party, because the Tea Party is basically an obstructionist party, I think, as are people on both sides of the spectrum. And I think you had that in the country 2 or 3 years ago. People were really fed up with the divide. And I said, probably here in this forum or downstairs 5 years ago, that the nominees of the two parties were going to be Barack Obama and John McCain. Because everybody in this country were fed up with the extremists, and those were the two people who could most easily reach across aisles and could work across partisan divide. That Hillary Clinton was a bit too polarizing, and that McCain, being a maverick, and every McCain legislation is, McCain-Feingold, McCain-Lieberman, McCain-Kennedy, whatever it may be. So those would be the two nominees, because the country was hungry for that. So that did happen. Unfortunately, it happened, and then I think one of the disappointments, actually I'm a supporter of Obama. I think he's good. I think he's actually worked out pretty well. But where I am disappointed was I think he could have worked a little bit harder, even though I think the fault lies with the Republicans 60% and the Democrats 40%, to create bipartisanship, especially on something like health care. Now, you ask me what is from the center. Let me try to define. On any particular issue, for example, on health care, you can start by saying, let's go to first principles. And the first principles on health care for most liberals and Democrats are get more people covered. In fact, we want as close to universal coverage as possible. For most Republicans, it tends to be, let's make sure the costs are contained, and we don't raise the cost of the taxes, and tort reform, whatever, to be part of it. Once again, you could say, you could find the principles that if you put Bob Dole and Tom Daschle together, as we did at the Aspen Institute, because this is what we do at the Institute, trying to find the common ground. You could have a list of principles, and they could get to something. We'd say, okay, we will be willing, to make sure that more people are covered and trying to get close to universal. If you can do this on the cost side, and you could craft something that a Dole and a Daschle could believe in. Now, that to me would be a centrist approach in which you get 70% of what both sides. That's not a particularly contentious issue. Even on school prayer, abortion, affirmative action, whatever it is, you can carve out, I think, a ground in which 70% of Americans would agree with you 70%, if you know what I mean. They'd agree with 70% of what you said, 70% of the Americans. That to me, or an 80-20 rule, if you want to call it that. So I think on any particular issue, any person in this room could sit down with 3 or 4 other people and say, that would be pretty much a bipartisan, non-ideological compromise of the principles that are deeply held principles of people on the left and the right, or libertarian, interventionist, all the different factions there are. I thought that could have been done with health care. Maybe it couldn't have been. Maybe it was inevitable the Republicans were going to push it too much. Maybe it was inevitable the Democrats had 59 to 60 votes who were going to push it through. But that's, anyway, we can talk more about what that means in various other fields.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Reed Capolino. I'm a student at the Harvard Mechanics School. Mr. Isaacson, I had a question. Walter, I had 2 questions. One being how, it seems to me that Barack Obama is really from his office. It's a case study. And also, I would say, Bill Clinton, at his time in office, both fairly temporizing figures eager to make compromise.
Yeah.
Putting forth essential proposals. So my one question is, how do you go about leading when people you're negotiating with state their success on the work area?
Well, that's a problem. That's why I said, and you could argue whether my 60% is too low or too high. And I try not to be partisan myself. I've been registered as an independent my whole life. I think at least 60% of the blame is a political calculation by the Republican Party that by just saying no, they gain the political advantage instead of Grassley finishing the compromise with Bach instead of Grassley and Bach was good. No. I think it's partly because of what I said about everything from the polarization of the political field, because if you're Grassley and you're about to compromise, or if you're Corker from Tennessee and you're about to compromise with Chris Dodd, all of a sudden the Republican base is about to eat you alive. I mean, Charlie Crist is going to lose in Florida because of it. Poor Bob Bennett, one of the most conservative people I've ever met, part of the Aspen Institute. Bob Bennett is very conservative. When I say finding common ground, it doesn't mean you give up your principles and become mushy. You don't get more conservative than Bob Bennett. But he is part of an Aspen group studying Islam, and he's paired with Barbara Mikulski. We did it partly because she's very liberal and he's very conservative, but also because he's about 7 foot 2 inches tall and she's about 3 foot 8 inches tall. And when they walk into a mosque together, they look so weird, but they also understand, how to work together. That is going to hurt, not help Bob Bennett. He's considered somebody who, even though he has like a perfect voting record amongst conservative groups, has worked too close at a Democrat. So how do you do it? You got to change the fact that the extreme controls the election. Meaning, if a lot of people start losing in primaries, a lot of moderate Republicans start losing, you're going to be in real trouble. I mean, it's going to make things worse. And that's partly because everything from the Tea Party movement that's attacking anybody who will compromise, to Fox News, which is demonizing people to it. You got to rise above that. Did you have another point?
Yeah, my second question is, I agree with you entirely. Leadership is common ground, compromise is so good, but how do you ensure that you sowing that will actually produce a good outcome? This is one counterexample. The Iraq War had very broad support in the media, definitely above 50% of the country in Congress.
That's an incredibly good question, and it's a particularly good challenge to those of us who believe that you should try to craft something that 70% of the people can agree on before you go to war, before you change the entire healthcare economy of America. You don't want to do it in a partisan way. You want to try to craft it so 70% can say, I pretty much on balance accept that. That may not get you the best sentence. For example, if you had a totally right-wing or a totally left-wing healthcare bill, you could argue either one might have been better than this compromise. I would not argue that. I actually think this healthcare bill is a lot better than people think it is, and the downside is not as big as people think it is. But, you could blunder into Iraq in a bipartisan way. I think Iraq is a special case, meaning the support for the Iraq war that started with Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton, that was mistaken information, bad policy judgment, but it was not the result of compromise that got us there. It was the result of a lot of mistakes, and you could even still argue that from what they knew at the time, it wasn't the wrong decision, and maybe what we know in retrospect is not the wrong decision, although I tend to think it was a bad decision in retrospect, but you could argue that either way. So I think when you get that's the rap against compromise, is that you get a compromised bill. I defy you to find anything, from the civil rights bills to whatever, and all of them, Social Security, civil rights, all pass with bipartisan support. Not overwhelming bipartisan support, but there's been no major legislation, including Social Security, that didn't have some support from the minority parties.
Until healthcare.
Until healthcare. That's the whole point I'm making, which is that healthcare, the first time you had to do it. I suspect that if Baucus and Grassley had worked out a bill in the Finance Committee, and the more radical Pelosi's and people in the White House hadn't stopped them, and the more radicals on the right hadn't stopped Grassley from continuing to work with them in snow and all, you would have gotten an even better rather than an even worse bill. But it's a good question. I would love you to try to find counterexamples where trying to find the common ground made something worse rather than better. And Iraq War doesn't qualify in my mind to be an example. Yeah.
My name is Ben Frisber. I actually don't go to Harvard.
Okay.
But my question is, so you suggested as a recourse to polarization, voting, and the way in which the public votes, but the public doesn't vote for its media, and to some degree, voting is based on information delivered from the media. I mean, media is a business. And so I wonder, did you discuss media being a culprit to the polarization of America? So what is the recourse? Is it?
Well, first of all, let me challenge your premise a bit, which is what happens when you do go to Harvard. You always get a premises challenge. People do vote for their media. In fact, it is the most democratic thing in the world today, which is you get to click on whatever you want. You get to, if you get really mad at Bill O'Reilly, just one button, and you voted against him, and you're somewhere else. And Nielsen and all sorts of web services are telling advertisers whose eyeballs are where. So both as a business and as a choice, there's more choice now than there was when I was growing up. I didn't like, the type of news I was getting from NBC, CBS, and ABC. I had no alternative. Now people have alternatives.
Then that makes me question if the media that is polarizing our country is so successful, are we then voting for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to say. I have 2 points on that. One of which is we are going to get the media we deserve because we are going to get the media we choose to tune into. I did say that sometimes technology, Paul Bettino's here, and he's great from the School of Engineering and Applied Science and does technology and entrepreneurship. Sometimes everybody says technology is benign, and it's only how we use it that matters. Sometimes technology, I think, does have a bias. And the bias when there's 500 channels and 5,000 websites is a little bit towards shrillness, because shrillness makes you stand out. Whereas if there's an enforced technology that says there can only be 3 networks and everybody's got to go for a third of the population, that tends to try to create a mass audience rather than a shrill audience. So that is a technological problem we face, and it will be. I do think that, I hope, there are enough people who actually want sensible, reported news that's not just somebody sitting in a basement offering opinions, but somebody's actually been to a place, reported things. That will always command an audience. I'm going to get into something controversial here, so we can do it slowly. That will command an audience, not necessarily a passionate, wild audience that can attract eyeballs for advertising, but it will attract an audience for whom this has high value information, meaning information that's not just some Glenn Beck screaming at me, but is however you want to define high value. We have a technological problem that I think we can fix, and will fix pretty soon, which is if there's high value information on the internet, there's actually very little way that the person producing that high value information can get paid to do it. All information all news on the internet tends to be free, whether it's Time Magazine or The Atlantic or great reporting from the New Yorker. Everybody puts up all this stuff for free. So you're totally dependent on gathering eyeballs for advertisers. So it tends to. If you had a system, this is another jag I'm on. Sorry. Yeah. If you had a system that allowed people who truly valued high-value content to pay for, or made it easy, so that the New York Times to me is high-value content. I want it every day, and even though some people think it's far too liberal or think it's biased or this, that, and the other, to me, I want the New York Times every day. I'd be willing to pay, 99 cents a month for the New York Times, or 99 cents a week for the New York Times. An impulse purchase, just as I would if Coldplay comes out with a new song, or Neville Brothers repurposing things. I'll hit iTunes and 99 cents is nothing. I think we're about to move to a model of impulse buying, or easy buying, I should say impulse, but where you can pay for content on the web. And I think, I may be wrong, that that will incent the creation of high-value content for people who can afford to pay for it, who want good stuff like maybe the New York Times, as opposed to the cheaper stuff, which is just somebody spouting opinions that then can gather eyeballs for advertisers. Secondly, I think we as a nation have to be willing to do that. That if we allow the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the New Orleans Times-Tribune or Time Magazine or whatever to totally go under, that's not a good thing. So, I think it'll stop, sorry. My daughter disagreeing with me on paying for content on the internet. She says that. So anyway, I think what we need is a business model that allows us to reward high-value content that's well reported for those who want it. Without being too elitist, I'll say that's a mass, you might not get a mass audience who wants to pay for things, but you will get 10, 15, 20% of any population that says, I want this high-value information. So I'm hoping that will help.
And do you think that audience will pull from the center? I mean, do you think that audience, because you say for those who want it, and I'm just curious, who are the people who want it? Are they
I don't think it's center per se. I think it's a difference between reported, reliable, fact-checked news versus just opinion, which is both cheaper to produce and gathers a more shrill audience and gather eyeballs. So I tend to want what I would call objective, and people start arguing on you can't ever have objective information, but you can. You can have real reporters who are there in Afghanistan and they're trying to say what's happening without a particular bias. They may have some bias, but they're trying hard to avoid the bias. And likewise, they're out there covering what's happening, whether it's at a Tea Party rally yesterday in Washington, or at a John McCain campaign speech, or at in the Green Zone in Baghdad, or wherever it may be. That is very costly. When I ran CNN, and I want to keep this off the record, I don't know if it'll stay off the record, but I had a lot of money, $1 million a day to keep a Baghdad bureau on. I was having Christian Amanpour doing Seriers on Islam. She would get crushed in the overall ratings by just a Bill O'Reilly yelling about something. There was pressure put on me. Surely we can get rid of all these overseas bureaus. Surely we don't need all this reporting. We can make a lot more money with just talk radio type posts who go on CNN. Now I was hiring people like Anderson Cooper, who I thought were really good reporters, not hiring Keith Olbermann, saying he worked at CNN, but was not going to be out there reporting, just giving opinions. So it's not so much that any of these people are centrist, it's that they are producing what they aim to be unbiased and objective information. They want to be on the ground and say, here's what's happening in Haiti, Afghanistan, or Iraq, and they're not there to prove a point that America is war criminals or America is the savior. They're just there to tell you what's happening. That is both expensive, it's high value, and to me, it tends to be what the center would want. Because if you're on the extremes, you're not necessarily looking for, let me just get the objective facts. And so that's what I mean by that type of high value, centrist information.
My name is Susie Ellis, and I'm a freelance writer. I live in a relatively small town in the area, and we have a town meeting form of government. We have a community newspaper that I write for, it comes out weekly. And a lot of what you're talking about resonates with me because one of the big problems that we have is that the newspaper's not well funded, and the way the editor works, that isn't paid well, is that he responds to internet hits as when he's been published. And what's happened is that the paper's degenerated to the point where people are really disgusted. But it also has the effect that the majority of the population just is disaffected. Right. So I'm wondering what your opinion is about looking at it from the opposite end of what you're talking about citizen journalism and the hope for that, and about...
If you get citizen journalism and things like that, after the storm in New Orleans, I went back to my old Central City neighborhood, which is now sort of famous because we kind of call it near Treme, because we were the next neighborhood over from Treme, and now Treme's famous. And we wanted neighborhood coverage. What homes are back? The fire department, like, how do you get your electricity turned on? So we wanted citizen journalists. And there was a whole group, including from Harvard, some people maybe here. They all went down to Broadmoor, and they began to, which was great, but only wealthy enough people who could come do it as a hobby or do it as a avocation could do it. You need to get it to be with citizen journalists, people can get paid to do it, so that real people can do it, who have to pay mortgages and put food on their family's table. Your case of a newspaper that is just trying to gather eyeballs is perfect, because the news either polarizes or just degenerates into being not serious, high-quality news like an anti-fascist. If people could pay for the high-quality stuff, there would at least be that option. You could have the free news, you can have but there would also be an incentive, like, suppose you were going to do really deep reporting on the city town planning commission, zoning board, everything else, and you're going to say, but in order to see it, you got to pay me 99 cents a week or something. That would incent people to, and allow people, like to make a living, to actually do things that produce high-value information for communities that are being underserved now, when it's only advertising supported. The other thing you almost said, because he's going for advertising, if you're running a community paper, or frankly, if you're running the Times-Picayune or the Delta Democrat Times, and all you're doing is catering to advertisers, meaning you're not getting any money from your subscribers anymore, it's all free to subscribers, but you're just thinking of an advertiser. If you're catering to your advertisers, you're going to cater to your advertisers. This is not good in journalism. You want to have at least a check and a balance, and you owe loyalty to your readers, not to your advertisers.
But are the economics there in a smaller market to do what you're saying?
Not easily. And advertising in a small town, weeklies, it'll be 90% advertising all the time, because I mean there is a high advertising market, because the local grocery store and the local Ford dealership needs that local advertising base. But I do think there's a lot of money to be made, even by citizen journalists, with small, payments. Meaning, look, the New York Times has 50 million uniques per month to all those websites, including the Boston Globe. Uniques per month. No, unique visitors, not hits. If, every one of them was willing, to pay $1 a week, that's $200 million a month, times 12, you do the math, that's more money than the New York Times company could ever dream of. So, I do think people willing to pay 99 cents a week for things can add up, but it doesn't work on community papers. Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry, I'll get to the back in a minute.
Yeah. So I'm a student of the business school, and kind of just wanted to echo some of these concerns, because the New York Times has tried to put up a wall around the content it has and it's failed. The only paper that's been able to do it successfully is the Journal, and that's because of the acute benefits to financial information. So my question is, in the absence of being the third-party activator that can solve the collective action problem that the media faces, are these revenue streams enough to make up for the loss of classifieds to Craigslist, the loss of advertising to Google? I find it very optimistic, but I think this is what media professionals have been saying the last 15 years, because institutions are dying to give up. And so I just wanted to...
Well, I don't mean to be falsely optimistic. If you were asking me, should I go prepare myself to work for a big city newspaper for the rest of my career, I would say, what are your other options? So I'm not trying to be falsely optimistic. I will say a few things I say in the New York Times. I love the New York Times, I like our whatever. The notion that you're going to make people pay for the opinion, to give away your good reporting for free, was, to use a technical term, wacky. I mean, there's more opinion for free on the internet. To put up the paywall around your op-ed people, but to say David Rhodey's coverage of Afghanistan, which was the most amazing stuff, that's all I've done for free. I think they got that one. Secondly, is the technological thing. For me to subscribe to the New York Times or to the Times Tribune, whatever, it is a pain. It isn't the amount of money. It's, okay, I've got to stop. I've got to give them a whole page of things. I've got an email address, home phone number. I've got to give them my credit card number. I don't want to do all that. That's why I instantly buy songs I like on iTunes. I buy everything I'm wearing. I bought at Amazon. I don't ever go shopping for clothes. In fact, waiting to come over here, I just got, a couple more khakis because this is getting stale. But it's because on Amazon, they've already got my thing in. I can do one-click payment. It is frictionless. The mental transaction cost is approximately zero on iTunes or Amazon. It's huge, the mental transaction cost on, a place like where you're trying to subscribe to a newspaper. So, I'm actually working a bit on doing a biography, not totally public, but on Steve Jobs. I'm out there a whole lot watching what he's doing. Once he does 99 cents for the New York Times for the week, and you can click on it the way you do a song, I think it'll be easier to get people to it. So I think the problem the New York Times and others would face putting up that paywall was partly we don't have the impulse. If I were to invent something, if I were in Paul Patino's group, and I was supposed to say, what should I do technologically? Easy payment systems would be the perfect thing digitally. I want to do what I can do in some other places. Just like I could drive from Washington to here with an easy pass and tolls up, and I don't say, gee, is the Delaware Bridge $3.99 or $4.99, whatever. You just go on through it, you don't mind. I want to be able to go to the Coke machine, I want to be able to go on the internet, whatever, and have a digital wallet that if something is cheap and is an impulse purchase, I just click on it. I don't need a receipt, I don't need itemized bills or anything. And I would create a digital purse on the thing, just like my Easy Pass is in my car. So whenever I'm online, I have a digital purse that puts $25 from my bank account in it every, whatever it needs for replenishing. And whenever I see something I want for 50 cents or 49 cents or $1.99, I click on it and it takes that money out of there. That would end all the friction and I think that would allow bloggers, citizen journalists, garage bands, artists, people making little video games, all to sell stuff like that. You have a blossoming new economy.
Yeah, I guess not only with music, you've got music labels that control all the content, whereas in newspapers, it's not necessarily the case. So the incentive to protect from that kind of aggregated is a lot higher.
And also, look, I ran Time Magazine and its new media division when we were on AOL. Before you were born in 1992, there was no such thing as a web browser. Mark Andreessen was still in college. And so you had to go into the walled gardens of CompuServe Prodigy AOL. Then the web comes along, and we put it all out there for free. Because it's like, oh, the web, information wants to be free. And we forget the second half of Stuart Brand's mantra, which is information must be expensive as well, because information at the right time is the most valuable commodity. So, I started trying to get Time Magazine to continue to charge people. But they would Newsweek sit there totally for free. No hope. I mean, as much as I love Time, it's pretty much interchangeable with Newsweek. Newsweek's free and Time's $1, you're going to go to Newsweek. So that's a problem. I do think both models can coexist. That there can be high value information that somebody like myself, if it's really simple, will pay $9. Look, we talk about a Coldplay song, you can get it for free on the web. Or you can pay 99 cents on iTunes. Why do most people suddenly, after, so 4 years ago it changes, start paying 99 cents when a song comes out instead of getting it for free? It's just a whole, if it's easier and safer and more convenient, you'll pay the 99 cents. Yeah. Back there.
My name is Philip Schrögel. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I would go back a step back to politics more.
Good.
So this
I didn't mean to get into paid content.
So my question is coming not from the US. So I have the observation that I'm from Germany. So then this whole discussions, it's very difficult to reach a compromise because very often people don't attack the position, but the people, or not even the people, and the institutions itself. So it's the government that is bad, or it's the governor that is bad, and not the idea they're actually fighting. And so, do you see a way out of that?
Yeah, I mean, I will now say something optimistic. And for all the bad things I've said, this year in the United States, in the past 14 months, We've created an enormous TARP program to take the worst economic crisis for the past 80 years or 60 years and pretty much, I think, get out of it. Likewise, save the financial system and the banking system. Likewise, get closer to a universal health care system than we've ever gotten in our history. Things can work. I just think that at the moment, it's not so much the personalization of politics as the polarization of politics that I think is hurting things. Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Brower. I studied at this school so long ago it was John Kennedy was kind of president at the school in Lithow.
We're in the Lithow building.
I would like
Belfort. We were.
there is a Lithow building part of the road.
Yeah.
I would like to challenge your call for less partisanship and more bipartisanship by raising some major fundamental changes that have happened in our society in the last 30 years. One is we now have a very powerful social class structure, the most powerful since I was born in 1932. Secondly, as part of that, the rich 1% elite now controls, some people say, more than 95% poor have in terms of income or wealth. Along with that, we have the corruption of our Congress. This is the most corrupt Congress in my lifetime. Third, fourth, whatever, you talk about partisanship between two parties. I don't think we have two parties. The Democrats and the Republicans are kind of two halves of the same elite party. It costs millions of dollars, folks, to run for Congress today because we don't have public financing of elections. And the lobbyists are running in place. So, given all that, what's your challenge? Why should we have bipartisanship and compromise between two wings of the same corrupt elite political party?
Well, I think you've made a very passionate case, and I frankly don't quite agree with it, but that's why it's great to be in a forum here. I would say that the greatest challenge we face next is a fiscal one. And I would think you probably wouldn't agree, but that the fiscal overspending we're doing. And I think there's a pretty simple ways out on Social Security, a compromise that usually works, and even on taxes and budgeting. But it does take both parties pulling together. Otherwise, these type of crises will continue. I really can't rebut your worldview. I mean, I heard it, I get it, and it's partly a matter of temperament and belief.
Well, if we have a fiscal crisis, how come are we still spending 60 plus years after World War II, half the federal budget on the military-industrial complex that General Eisenhower warned us about?
Yes, sir.
I just wanted you to talk about what the modern day analog is to the wise man. Because it seems to me that, Obama pointed out in the second quote that, in his time in Congress, it's funny, he observed for time here, but become much more like their donors and much less like their constituents. So I think it's good folks like the Aspen Institute and others that sort of bring together the great and the good on different sides of the aisle and try to get them toward a common ground. But it seems to me those people can stop that and follow the pulse. Talking about just like those who live in Washington, being top 1%, etc., a lot more in common than people in Cambridge in this room with people in a different room in whatever rural Georgia.
Right.
So what is the big challenge? The ones addressing the global challenge, the ones that are not just cut back.
I think the media has a role of trying to create common ground. That has failed at doing. In terms of the wise men today, that's also used to be a role of the media as well as the Kenneth and Mullen and Isaacson, meaning you had the Lippmans and whatever. And there were criticisms that they were too much a part of it. But I also think that Obama's done a pretty good job on the fiscal issue by picking Alan Simpson and Rustin Bowles. I mean, those would be two wise men, I would give you. And I think that on any issue, had you gone that route, Daschle and Dole, where you'd almost said form a commission and do health care, you could have gotten to a better result. But neither the politics nor the media rewards that these days.
I guess my question is, even getting a good commission to study a problem, to what extent is that going to reverse the polarization of the country? I'm saying maybe.
Well, Larry Summers was at dinner last night, or night before last we were talking to him, and on this commission, and I asked him the same question. You got polarization, what business can do? that the commission's main role will be education. If an Alan Simpson, who is very vibrant but on the right, but understands the fiscal crisis, and that will probably use the tax increase, and that Erskine Bowles is very solid with him. All those people are debating and discussing, and they get a lot of coverage. It'll help me in educational policy for what we need to do. But, you know, I do think it's basically getting a populace that decides they want something done rather than they'd rather engage in polarized warfare. Yes, sir.
My name's Eli. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Education. I watch The Daily Show quite a bit, and my question is about The Daily Show. In addition to being kind of an entertaining, crass show at times, I think it has an amazing ability to kind of illuminate the hypocrisy of the extreme partisanship. And that it shows the politicians saying something that they disagree with something Obama is doing, and then they come back to the segment of them saying they were for it, Bush was for it, and vice versa. So I wonder, are they only able to do that because they come from a standpoint of comedy and levity, or is there a place in the major networks or mainstream media or a respected news source like the New York? Is there a place for that?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we should have more daily shows.
Yeah.
And people say, well, it's really bad, those young people get their news from, you know, the Daily Show. Well, first of all, it's not bad, because it's a really good show. Secondly, it's not true, because you wouldn't laugh at the jokes if you didn't already have some idea of the news that they were talking about. If you were totally clueless about what was happening, you'd find the whole show baffling. I do think, to get to a real core of your question, one problem the New York Times has, besides all the other problems I said, and as I say, I love the New York Times, one problem is the New York Times is phenomenally boring half the time. It should have fun. So should Time Out. When I was at Time, I tried to make it, you know, humorous, poking fun, hypocrisy, you know. There's this earnestness and self-seriousness in the mainstream media that is one of its worst enemies. I was going to say it's worst enemy, it's got so many enemies these days. So if the New York Times could just take 10% of the DNA of the Daily Show and have a little bit of fun, it would be 10 times more exciting to read, and it would help. If I were running a newspaper now, my goal would not, my first goal would be to liven it up. This thing doesn't have to be so boring. And make everybody watch the Daily Show. All right, that's one. And then we'll get a drink. Go ahead.
Oh, so this is just to go back to.
I think, wait, let me ask. I'm sorry, when am I supposed to? Yeah, all right. Oh, 5:15. Okay, we'll do another 5 to 10 minutes and then have a drink. Yes. Go ahead.
So this was I wonder if this was at all a political failing in terms of governing from the center. So in Atlantic magazine, just this past month, they had an article on Timothy Geithner, and it kind of posited that deregulation was sort of a centrist idea, starting with Carter and going through the Clinton administration, kind of popular on both sides. And I wonder if that's an example of just, and I don't know if it's an anomaly or if it's just more indicative of potential evils. Not saying that governing from the center is evil, but that if deregulation...
I mean the Larry Summers, Tim Geithner ability over the past 12 years to deregulate in a way that had led to a financial crisis and an attack on centrist policy.
And through Republican and Democratic administrations.
Well, it's like saying the Iraq War should be blamed on the fact that both parties were for it. To say financial dereg, both parties are for it, therefore we don't like things both parties are for. I don't follow the syllogism exactly. I do think you're right that there are, actually it's not centrist policy. There gets to be a mainstream establishment orthodoxy. Free trade is the highest of the orthodoxy of the mainstream establishment. Deregulation, perhaps the financial industry became one. That ought to be challenged. They're not wrong because they're bipartisan. They may be wrong because they're part of a theology of the establishment. I don't necessarily think either of those are wrong, but then I'm a representative of the theological establishment. I'm not a key factor. Speaking of wise men, Nick Burns would fall into the category. We're talking basically about who can transcend partisanship these days, especially in foreign policy. I know most of you know Nick, who teaches in the next building over. but Dick was both Madeleine Albright and Condi Rice, a very top official in the U.S. State Department. And, you know, as much as I've said there's been a polarization, there has also been a strand. If you look at it, Obama's foreign policy isn't that much of a break. I mean, certainly his fiscal policy, despite the fact that Republicans on the right are calling them socialists, you know, it's basically been a Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke financial policy that's not exactly been socialist. So I don't think you have a totally polarized system now. I just think that the popular voice, the media voice, the electoral voice, Congress has gotten polarized. And for the first time in our history, we have done an enormous major transformation of our society, the healthcare one, and done it on a strict party line vote. That is a bad trend. I don't know, Nick, is it happening, you think, going to happen more in foreign policy, or it hasn't yet?
No, I think there's more consensus on foreign policy. And I do see, I think the president has corrected.
Civil like that.
I guess I'd say, Walter, the president has corrected for some of the problems that President Bush had in foreign policy. But I still think there is substantial bipartisan support for the major lines of what the president's trying to do. When I will see, the Senate has to ratify the START agreement, then the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and that second one is going to be a real test of whether bipartisanship lives in Washington. I'm optimistic in the first. I question whether the Republicans will give the president support in the second. I hope they do. And the president's followed the right course on that.
And the Republican base is starting to demonize the whole nuclear posture of the Obama administration, saying, you know, we refuse, and I think distorting it. And I assume as somebody who's not a member of either party, you would think it's somewhat distorted by the Republican base.
I do. I think the president, if you haven't read President Obama's nuclear posture review, which was announced 10 days ago, it is a revolutionary leap forward in the way we look at the usefulness or lack thereof of nuclear weapons. And what he essentially said is, we will not use nuclear weapons against countries that don't have them. And number two, we no longer have to fear what Walter and I feared in our youth in college, and that is a static state-to-state attack. We have to fear nuclear terrorism by terrorist groups. And I think that the president has updated, a long time after it should have been updated, the way we think about nuclear weapons in a much more positive and productive way. So I support what he's doing.
And I think you would find that Dick Lugar, who's the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, totally supportive of that. But you already have Sarah Palin and many others out there this week saying, including Liz Cheney, the daughter of the vice president, saying that this is a surrender, right? So I think that's where the polarization is happening.
Tremendously disappointed to see Sarah Palin on Boston Common, but also just to
you
see.
went down to see her?
I did not go.
I thought you were disappointed when you went down to see her.
Disappointed that she was there. But no, I think I think that's where we're seeing the partisanship, because the president is getting some traction on foreign policy. I suspect the right is just trying to undercut him for political reasons without really taking time to consider the larger implications of what they're saying. Because I do think the president is very much middle of the road, but heading us in the right direction.
And what's hurting it is the body politic. For example, Lugar is fine. I mean, he's in his last term, whatever, he'll support it. McCain was somebody who could have supported this new nuclear posture, who gets it, but who won't because he's being challenged by a teabagger in the Republican primary in his home state. And I think, I mean, I'm not, I don't know, Hayworth, is his name? Yeah, Jason Hayworth, maybe he's not fully a teabagger, but I think he's being endorsed by the teabaggers, right? So that is keeping, I mean, if McCain came out and said this nuclear policy is fine, then it would fly through. But he can't because of the challenges people have from the party base these days. Yeah, you're not that you, oh, okay, there was a
Sir, you speak like mom and apple pie. I mean, it makes great, you see the responsiveness here. You're very influential. When you speak to top decision makers, about your centrist ideals. Kind of a two-part question is, are they accepting of that? And then do they give you a reason why they don't see it can move forward too quickly?
Well, if you talk about healthcare, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, listening to people in the administration, it's been on the Hill. Zeke Emanuel, for example, the brother. He was very much in favor and thought you could craft a bipartisan healthcare. He was working on it. And his brother, Bob, pulled the plug on it first week of August and said, don't go for Democrat. And you could get into all sorts of debates about why we had to do it, they say why we had to do it or why we did, whatever. Everybody expresses, because it is mom and apple pie, lip service. But they wanted bipartisanship, but the other side wouldn't allow them to have it. To keep picking on poor Nick, Nick works with me at the Aspen Institute and runs the Aspen Strategy Group. For 40 years, approximately, I don't know exactly, the Aspen Strategy Group's been around 30 years, whatever, 30 years. It's been run at the moment by Brent Scowcroft and Joe Nye, you all know both of them, by Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar, and moderate Democrat. And they went and they did Nunn-Lugar, the last great nuclear breakthrough, which was to decommission safely nuclear former Soviet Union, those type of things. So there are groups like that can work together, and they do. We have just entered into an era of talk radio, Fox News, and that matter, MSNBC News maybe, and John McCain and Bob Bennett, who are purely good, solid Republicans, both about to lose maybe to extremists from their base. So that's what's causing the problem. If I went right now to John McCain, who's spoken every year up until this year at the Aspen Institute, and said, why are you doing all this? I mean, I get the wink, I get the nod, and say, hey, I'm up for re-election. And this is what's happening to me. So it's not really their fault. All righty.
So I think we can probably continue this in the reception just outside here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. That has, I think, been the core of what America works. I happen to be, so my politics, one of those people who believe that the country is best governed when governed from the center. And this is something that hasn't been happening in the past 15 or 20 years. Part of it is a great ideological divide. Part of it is just pure partisanship. As Henry Kissinger used to say about the faculty club a few blocks away, the fights are so bitter because the stakes are so small. People were getting worked up over the small differences they have just on pure partisan reasons. I've always looked for leadership as being a form of finding common ground. When I was a student here, I started work on a book with a friend of mine who was a classmate of mine in college, Evan Thomas, and it was about 6 foreign policy friends. We called it the Wise Men because they were 6 people who were brought in by Harry Truman to help shape American foreign policy right after World War II. And they weren't famous people, but they had a passion for a foreign policy that would rise above partisanship. It was Gene Atchison, Abel Harriman, John McCloy, Robert Clovis, Kennan, and Bolin, all of whom had intersected at Yale or Harvard, had gone to Wall Street together, and then gone into American foreign policy. And the reason we did it is because we were coming out of the Vietnam period back when we were in college. We came just after the end of the Vietnam War, but then it polarized this nation. And so we were looking for a war with its allies, including Russia, against fascism, is going to be engaged in a new global struggle, which is against the spread of Soviet-backed communism, and that you're going to need a whole new set of institutions to deal with that struggle. And so they had a creativity as well as a bipartisanship when they did it. And that creativity led them to understand that the new struggle they were going to be engaged in was going to be partly a military struggle, so they create, out of whole cloth, and never done before, NATO, a defensive military alliance. They realized it was going to be an economic struggle, so they create the World Bank and all the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade. They realize it can be a struggle for hearts and minds. So you have Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and other things coming up. They too realize that we're going to have to show that our side will be more prosperous in a way. So that's where the Marshall Plan and other things come from. So you have this enormous burst of creativity of institutions nobody ever thought of having before, and even the United Nations comes out of that. And that burst of creativity happens within a 2 or 3 year period, 1946, 47, 48, maybe 49. And then you even have to frame it to say, what is a struggle? So you have George Kennan and others framing it as a containment doctrine, and NSC 68, which sort of balances the commitments we're going to need to the resources we have. So there's this great framework for it and great new creative institutions. The reason I say this is because we're in a similar period. And, at least we kind of woke up to it a bit on September 11, 2001, which is that there's another struggle going on in this world. And even though the Cold War is over, we're engaged in the global struggle. And yet, it's been almost 10 years. There's been absolutely no creativity. We're still using the old institutions. We're still using NATO, which was created as a defensive alliance to stop tanks going through the Volga Gap in Germany. We're using it to be involved in Afghanistan. We're still using Voice of America and Radio Free Europe instead of creating a new Facebook or Google Groups or YouTube that would be a way of interacting and engaging with the world. We're still using broadcast radio. We're still using the old banking institutions. And so there hasn't been a comparable period of creativity, partly because after the brief period after 9/11, there became again the polarization, and nobody could really work together to create new ways of looking at the world. We haven't even agreed in a nonpartisan way what the struggle is. There's been no Kennan saying, Kennan didn't say the struggle was against communism. That wouldn't have worked. It was very specific how he defined it, which is the spread of Soviet-backed communists that tried to expand to this world, and we were going to contain them. It was a pretty simple concept. Now the notion of radical Islamic jihadism, whatever it may be, there's not even a great agreement of what we're struggling against in this world, partly because everybody has made it a polarized and partisan activity. Having been so appalled by the growing polarization after the Life
A student at Harvard Medical School and a representative of the Harvard Graduate Council, which is co-sponsoring this event along with the Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. We're very fortunate today to have Walter Isaacson here to speak to us about leadership in modern times. I can't think of many people who are as qualified as Mr. Isaacson to be speaking on this subject, given that he has not only written extensively about leadership and great American leaders, past and present, but also himself led many of our nation's most influential organizations. Mr. Isaacson currently serves as the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, which is a nonpartisan educational and policy studies institute in Washington, D.C. He has been the chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. Mr. Isaacson began his career at the Sunday Times of London and then the New Orleans Times-Picayune State Item. He joined Time magazine in 1978 and served as a political correspondent, national editor, and editor of new media before becoming the magazine's 14th editor in 1996. He became chairman and CEO of CNN in 2001, and then president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He is the author of numerous books, including most recently American Sketches, a book on great leaders, creative thinkers, and heroes of a hurricane. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walter Isaacson.
I hope to speak for a few minutes and then make this much of a discussion. But the challenge of leadership in the current time boils down to the extreme polarization and ripping apart of the center time when people tried to lead the nation by finding the common ground based on the values we stood for. And so we picked these 6 people, 3 of them Republicans, 3 of them Democrats, all best friends who worked for Democratic and Republican administrations. One of the touchstones of the partisanship was Robert Lovett, one of our characters, when he tells Harry Truman about the idea of having a plan to rebuild Europe, because they realized they were in a great global struggle after the end of World War II. They have a plan for the economic rebuilding of Europe that they've been talking about, and he has to tell President Truman, and we want to call it the Marshall Plan, not the Truman Plan, because that will cause it to be less partisan. It's General Marshall, somebody stands above partisanship. So Truman says to Lovett, you're absolutely right, otherwise those damn Republicans will try to kill it. And there's a pause, and Lovett says, you forget, Mr. President, I am one of those damn Republicans. And Truman said, yes, I always forget, because he had a group of foreign policy advisors that were not fit based on party. The other thing about the wise man is by doing so, they could have a leadership that was extremely creative. At the end of World War II, as Averell Harriman said, Americans were ready to come back home, go to the movies and drink Coca-Cola. Nobody wanted to be engaged in the world. But as the war was ending, from the Potsdam Conference, from the Yalta Conference to the Potsdam Conference, it suddenly becomes clear that the United States is going to be engaged, having just won a war.